Hello, Pilani. I haven't greeted you. My respects, sir.
How are you doing, Dion?
Oh, very well, thanks. As good
Under,
as can
as
be
good
with
as one can be.
yeah, as a pensioner, full-time loafer.
No, but you keep yourself busy.
Well, at least out of trouble. But if you want to talk about a very active and busy pensioner, then it's Johan Willemse.
Ah.
He's turned retirement into a second profession.
And then we need to learn from him. What is he doing?
I'm afraid to learn from him.
Tú también, ¿no?
Hola, Humberto.
Hola, Dion, how are you?
Very well, thanks. And you?
Bien, bien, very well, thank you. Thank you.
Still a member of the working class?
Yes, I'm the office now, but I'm the only person in the office in the old center.
Oh, but didn't you get a notice from your colleagues that you should keep away?
Hola, Humberto.
Sí, pero la conexión de internet es muy buena aquí, ¿eh?
Sí.
Hola,
Humberto.
podemos empezar.
But the connection of internet here in the office is very well, Dion. Yes.
Okay.
All right.
Excellent. I think we can start.
Yeah, I think people are joining in.
Yeah.
Susanna.
Ambassador, you go first. Thank you.
Thank you.
Señor,
hola, Humberto.
Señor Romero, usted va a leer los dos textos, ya se los envié.
Muy bien.
No,
bueno,
ya le envié el primero, prefiero que usted lo lea. Bueno, se lo envía a su correo electrónico.
Thank you, colleagues. I think we're ready to start. Yeah, Susanna, I think you can get us going before Ambassador gives her remarks.
Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, professors. Good afternoon to all our audience who have kindly connected. We are now ready to start the event. So I give the first word to our ambassador of Mexico in South Africa, Her Excellency Ana Luisa Fajer. Thank you.
Thank you, Susana. It's a great pleasure for me to be here in this webinar. Hola, Humberto. Gusto en verte hasta México. It's very good to see you, friends, Dion and Pilani, and of course, Susana. I think this is a great opportunity to discuss about agricultural and food vulnerability, which is one of the chapters of the wonderful book called Global South Powers in Transition, a comparative analysis of Mexico and South Africa. Let me, you're showing the book. Yes, that's the book. I have my own book, but it's in my office and I am now in the meeting room. So, but I have my book as well. Let me first express my total gratitude to Dr. Pilani Mtembu, the executive director of the IGD and his team, and very especially to Susana Caputi for putting this seminar together. We have been discussing for a long time about the possibility and the good idea that it would be to be in this webinar, but obviously, well, pandemic, as always, was an obstacle, but I'm glad that we were able to do this webinar. To the speakers, my sincere appreciation for your enthusiastic response to our invitation. And last but not least, I would really like to congratulate Dion and Humberto, editors of this excellent book, which enables us to see each other and learn from each other and to discover how similar our countries and our people are. This is a real intercultural dialogue which contributes to build bridges and to promote people-to-people interaction. Actually, intercultural dialogue is the axis of our working plan at the embassy, and synchronicity is our key word. Allow me to share with you some of the characteristics that Mexico and South Africa share. Both are multi-ethnic, multilingual, and thus multicultural countries. While South Africa has 11 official languages, Mexico only has one official language, which is Spanish, but 68 indigenous languages. Geographically, Mexico and South Africa are located in crossroads. South Africa links the Indian and Atlantic Oceans and the Antarctica. Mexico is a natural passage from North America and South America and vice versa, as well as from Western Europe to the Far East. Both are mega diverse countries with similar challenges to protect our biodiversity and endemism, our ecosystems, and the social cultural values and traditions they imply. South African wines, which are really very good, are penetrating the Mexican market, while South Africa is the 11th largest importer of tequila. So it's the 11th largest market for tequila, so worldwide. Mexico is the world's 6th most important tourist destination, and Cape Town has been voted #1 destination in Africa and the Middle East. And although Mexico is 2 times bigger than South Africa and has doubled the population, 125 million people in 2 million square kilometers, the average age of Mexico's population is 27 years, and South Africa's is 27.5 years old. So we are countries of young people with huge potential. Both countries are strategic partners of the European Union and members of the G20. In the multilateral arena, Mexico and South Africa share the same interest in various issues. In the first place, we are firm supporters of the multilateral system. We coincide on the importance of nuclear disarmament and international peace and security. Mexico promotes an integral approach that includes the impact that small arms and light weapons have on conflict situations, and South Africa is a leader in the efforts of silencing the guns. Mexico and South Africa share an enormous concern in the issue of inequality of gender and have put people's well-being at the center of all our actions, broadening the scope of the protection of human rights and fostering South-South cooperation. That is why the governments of Mexico and South Africa pursue democratic and progressive agendas that share a focus on inclusive socio-economic development and the value of diversity. Our countries recognize the importance of bilateral, regional, and international cooperation to achieve the development goals of eradicating poverty and reducing inequalities and unemployment, guided by their mutual commitment to the full implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Agenda 2063 of the African Union, fighting corruption and strengthening the rule of law. Furthermore, Mexico and South Africa are responsible global actors that are strongly committed to the rules-based international order, are convinced of the irreplaceable value of diplomacy and multilateralism as the best option to assure that global governance responds to the needs of the people in the global South. Both actively contribute to the construction of consensus in their respective regional groups, in international organizations, and in informal mechanisms for consultation. In this regard, taking these convergences into account, Mexico and South Africa have agreed to systematize their consultation frames in the G20 meetings. COVID-19 was one of the reasons why the 3rd meeting of our binational commission could not happen in Mexico this year as it was agreed. However, thanks to technology, we have been able to update our bilateral agenda and move forward in concrete actions through virtual conversations between our deputy ministers and our officials. To conclude my welcoming remarks and to highlight agricultural bonds between Mexico and South Africa, let me refer very briefly to maize. Mexico is the country of origin and the place with the richest biodiversity of maize. Maize was successfully introduced to the world through the Portuguese descubridores, and today it is a staple crop in South Africa and most of the African continent. Indeed, ancient Mexicans domesticated maize 8,000 years ago, and through the millennia, they gained two important insights on this product. First is how to cultivate it and how to transform it into protein and energy, through the technique of nixtamalization. Around 60 different kernels of maize in 6 different colors are cultivated in Mexico. Studies have calculated that more than 700 different dishes in my country have maize as one of the main ingredients. The kind of maize you will need to use depends on what culinary preparation you have in mind. In South Africa, 7% of the population consume maize as their staple food. Therefore, research into improving this food crop is of vital importance for food and nutrition security. By the way, I love your pap here. I really enjoy pap. Although this is an open window for bilateral cooperation for development, what has happened in different occasions is that when maize crops are negatively impacted by drought, South Africa has supplied the Mexican market with its surplus and vice versa. The most recent example was registered in 2016 when Mexican exports of white maize were crucial to minimize the effects of the most severe drought in the last 40 years. So as you can see, Mexico and South Africa has much more in common than we thought. It is a real privilege for me to represent Mexico in this amazing and fascinating country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you very much for your introductory remarks. Silani, now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Susanna, and thank you, colleagues, for making time for this discussion today. I think for me, what's really important, I mean, just looking at the research that went into this publication, I'll mention again, Global South Powers in Transition. I think this is very important issue as we are discussing today, the effects of the pandemic, for instance, particularly on issues like food vulnerability, both in South Africa, in Mexico, but in the global South generally. 2020 presents one of the, essentially the first year since the various measures on human development were made, and since the UN started reporting on the progress of human development. So 2020 is essentially presenting the first year where we understand that human development is not actually improving, but is actually moving backwards. Why? Because we've been hit by a global pandemic. It's increased hunger, it's increased vulnerability, it's increased risk in many countries, including here in South Africa and also on the African continent. I think what is important in the issues that are going to be discussed today, and also in the research that went into this comparative analysis between South Africa and Mexico, is how can South Africa and Mexico and their respective regions build greater resilience when it comes to their food production systems, when it comes to ensuring access for everyone, but also when it comes to ensuring that those particular regions are also able to produce the type of foods that are actually preferred, consumed within their regions with the local knowledge. And therefore, what I mean is that ensuring that our regions and our countries are not only consumers, for instance, of technology from outside, or that they are essentially becoming increasingly importers of various foodstuffs, the type of foodstuffs that can actually be produced locally. And for me, and when I say locally, I'm not only speaking about the national level, I'm speaking about the regional level. Because I think one of the things that have become very important with COVID-19 is to ask the various regions of the global south, how can we become more resilient as regional economies? And when it comes to issues like, related to agriculture, when it comes to issues of food production, I think this is one of the key areas, particularly in a region where we find ourselves in, and also taking into account what Ambassador has just relayed in her opening remarks. So I think this is going to be one of the important things. And what I appreciate in the research that's gone into this publication is that it looks not only at the local and at the regional level, but it also looks at the type of global agreements that our countries have entered into and are entering into, whether it be the type of partnerships we're establishing within the framework of the World Trade Organization, whether it is the type of agreements we get into with the World Bank, with the IMF. I think what is important is that some of the research and some of the areas that people like Humberto Gonzalez and Dion Geldernes actually oversaw and also conducted is that whilst the book was written prior to COVID-19, I think when you look at some of the chapters, you will actually see that some of the issues around resilience are actually very pertinent to the type of landscape that we're finding ourselves in. And it's going to be important to ask those hard questions of how do we ensure that we do have systems in our regions which actually ensure greater resilience, but also which ensure that we can produce the things that we need and build those regional value chains. And if we do that, I think it will make our regions more resilient to future crises and to a post-COVID economic landscape. And so with those remarks, colleagues, I wish to just hand over back to Susanna. And I really look forward to the panel discussions and the presentations that we will be receiving from Dion Geldernes and Humberto Gonzalez. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pilani. Much appreciate your comments. Without further ado, I pass the floor to Professor Dion Geldernes from the University of Johannesburg. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna. My task is to provide a very brief introduction to, or if you prefer, background to the book. And I should begin with a confession, and that is to say that the book has been very long in coming. Its origins go back a full 10 years, Humberto, you'll recall, when the two of us first came up with the idea of embarking on a comparative study of Mexico and South Africa. Now, some people may immediately ask, well, why those two countries? They seem at first glance to be very odd bedfellows. After all, the two states are geographically far apart. We don't have a history of close cooperation. The two societies know very little about each other. And again, superficially, it would appear that the two countries are profoundly different in many respects, perhaps more different than similar. So why then this project? Well, those reasons I've just mentioned, in fact, encouraged us to conduct this project. And that is to say, we thought that in the academic market, there is a niche for a scholarly study that explains South Africa and Mexico to each other, and perhaps more ambitiously to a wider international order. Now, early on in this long process, Umberto and I decided on a title for the book, namely Global South Powers and Transition, Comparative Analysis of Mexico and South Africa. And in the main title, there are two golden threads. We acknowledge that Mexico and South Africa are global South countries, but not simply countries. Powers was a term deliberately chosen because they're both states of consequence in their respective regions, and they also have international ambitions. And another variable common to the two countries is that they are indeed from the global South, previously styled developing countries, or members of the group of 77. Now, how did we tackle the project? We, after some negotiation, Umberto, you'll recall, the two of us reached consensus on 10 key topics that need to be addressed, 10 issue areas that both our countries experience. And these topics include the domestic politics of the two states, respectively, their foreign relations, socio-cultural diversity, economic development, violence and criminal justice, among others, and then, of course, also the topic of today's presentations, namely the issue of agricultural and food vulnerability. We then decided to devote a chapter, a separate chapter, to each of these 10 issue areas. And in each chapter in the book, there are separate case studies by South African experts, Mexican experts from a variety of disciplines. And in addition to the two separate country studies on each of these areas in separate chapters, every chapter begins with a joint introduction in which the authors devise their own analytical framework within the broad guidelines of Global South countries in words of change. And each of these 10 chapters ends with a joint conclusion by the authors involved in the country studies. And in the conclusions, they then tease out the similarities and differences between our two countries. Of course, the book also has an introduction by the two co-editors. Umberto and I wrote the introduction and the conclusion. And in the introduction, we explained the methodology that we employed. One of the elements of which I haven't mentioned yet is that all our authors from Mexico and South Africa met together, once in Guadalajara, once in Johannesburg, because academics, after all, like to travel when someone else is paying. And at those two meetings, we workshopped drafts of all the chapters. In other words, all the authors had access to all the chapters of the book. What else should I say? The English version of the book was published last year, and Umberto, brave man, bless his good heart, he's soldiering on with the Spanish version, which is due either later this year or next year. It has been a mammoth task for Umberto, bearing in mind that the chapters were submitted in English, and Umberto has had to oversee the translation of all the chapters in Spanish and to set a uniform style for these various contributions. Finally, we hope, Umberto, I think I'm also representing you fairly when I say that we hope that our study, thanks to the contributions by these 26 authors from the two countries, will stimulate further comparative studies of Mexico and South Africa, I'm in fact already trying to tempt Umberto into a further inquiry on some aspects of our domestic societies. Umberto, I don't know whether between all the other emails dealing with the book, you've seen that suggestion that I've thrown into your lap, but also the different issue areas covered in the book. There is still a lot that can be said on each of those topics, and we hope that some of the authors that contributed might consider further exploration of these areas or additional issue areas. And then perhaps rather ambitious, we hope that the methodology that we crafted and applied in this study, that methodology might be used, perhaps in revised form, by other scholars interested in conducting comparative studies between countries that at first glance seem to be more different than similar. Ambassador, I should thank you also in your presentation. You, I think, also underlined the need for further inquiries into the two countries, into their interactions as far as the economies are concerned, domestic politics, and indeed their international roles. So I'd like to conclude with the hope, or with the suggestion, watch this space. The last word hasn't been spoken yet, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Heldenhuis. We listened to you with a lot of attention and hope your words and your wishes come reality. Dear Professor Umberto, we are ready to listen to your presentation. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Quiero agradecer también la invitación para participar y también la organización de este evento, pues que nos permite dar a conocer los resultados de un trabajo que nunca imaginamos realmente que nos llevaría tanto tiempo. Es un gusto realmente saber que hay colegas de Sudáfrica que están interesados cada vez más, probablemente en parte por nuestro trabajo, en saber lo que sucede en otros países, en otros continentes, como es el continente latinoamericano y en México. Yo preparé un texto para leer y voy a dejar que el señor Romero lo lea, porque el tiempo que disponemos es limitado. Entonces, por favor, señor Romero, sea tan amable de leer el texto. No está conectado.
¿Quién está conectado?
I think Mr. Romero is not connected in this moment. No, yes, is Mr. Romero? Perfecto. Ok, voy a... Thank you, Mr. Romero. Yes, now we are going, Johan and me are going to present an abstract or synthesis of the chapter 7 that we wrote, comparing South Africa and Mexico. Also, I'm going to ask Mr. Romero to read the text in order that you understand what I tried to do. I will present the introduction, and later I will present the Mexican case, and after me, Johan is going to talk about South Africa, and he is going to present the conclusions. Please, Mr. Romero, I'm going to project the field means in the yes. Okay, go ahead, please. Mhm.
Thank you, Professor Gonzalez. It was a very interesting presentation. I have now the pleasure to ask Professor Johannes Williamson to continue with his presentation. Thank you. Professor Williamson.
Good afternoon.
Yes, thank you.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we do.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're running a little bit out of time, so I'll be brief. Just to say that the book covers a large number of subjects, so this agricultural part that I'm going to present is obviously a very small part of the whole process that we've looked at. Let me just get this going. Okay. Into introduction on the South African part, I think the first in our introductory part to the South African agriculture, I think there was three things that stood out for us. The one is we are in a big demographic transition, more or less the same as in Mexico. We have rapid population growth, and then also we have a rapid urbanization. The urbanization is sort of supported by a social grant system where up to 18 million people in South Africa get social grants, which assist them in buying food. Part of the demographic transition is that our food demand are changing. People moving from rural areas into urban areas, food demand changes. They buy from supermarkets, they don't produce their own food. They buy packaged food and a number of things. And they also change from a as the ambassador said, from a pop diet to a meat diet, a more protein type of diet that changed our food system, and I'll explain to that a little later. I think the second thing in South Africa is that land reform is a big part of the policy. Humberto referred to that. And what we're finding is, and I'll allude a little later to that, we are really drifting into two separate agri-systems. The one is large commercial, mainly white or corporate farms, and they are very economies of scale are very important because they need to compete with imports. We are importing with the Brazilians, the Europeans, and they get a lot of subsidies. So the only way they can compete is to be on the same type of scale industrialization as the American and European farms. Then we have our more rural tribal areas that we are focusing on and trying to get them to commercialize agriculture, to grow production, to improve their own sort of food needs. And there's a lot of effort going on to that in agricultural and government efforts in that. And then also a large part of our agri-budget are spent on subsistence emerging farmers. Now, the result of that is that our larger farmers and commercial farms that need to compete are making use of a lot of the international inputs, the Monsantos, the John Deere's, all that technology are being used to be able to compete, while the small-scale farmers are really struggling to be on the same scale of production or production costs as the international farmers. And then we, unfortunately, with our land reform, as in most developing countries, the last couple of years, corruption has crept into our system, and we're struggling to get our land reform system going. Part of this is we have a tribal tenure of agriculture land, which makes it very difficult for small-scale farmers to invest in their land and to build up the land and to produce. I think the third thing that we summarized in the introduction, and Humberto referred to that, we went through a period of market deregulation, international integration. And what we did is we liberalized our domestic market totally. We had a number of marketing boards that were all closed down in 1994 with the democratization. And in the same period of time, we signed a GATT agreement, we signed the EU Free Trade Agreement and a number of other agreements, and we dropped border protection. I think that's very important. Our protection level at the border levels are of the lowest in an OECD study that was done over the last couple of years. So it really forced our domestic producers to be able to compete with international producers. And that marginalized the smaller scale producers even more. So we find this sort of branching in our agriculture becoming more acute. Economies of scale, large technologies or international technologies, GMO seeds, etc., are all used in a process to compete internationally. And what we found, and I'll show you a little later, by doing that, our exports in some industries have grown. So it's really a dichotomy in our agricultural system developing. I think that in the last couple of years since we wrote a book, obviously Dr. Pilani referred to the COVID event, which had a big impact on our society. You will see in the top graph that our economic growth dropped in the second quarter by 50%, 51%. We're really in a deep recession. Obviously, a lot of people lost their jobs. The second graph you will see, Humberto, our unemployment grew to 42% in the second quarter. Now, that's really a horrendous figure, because if you're unemployed and the social grant system don't support you, it means that we expect that hunger and poverty will just increase. And this is what we're currently dealing as a fallout after COVID-19. And then there's a third thing that are really limiting government support, and that is that we're running into a fiscal trap. Our debt, that's government debt at the bottom, are increasing at a rapid rate. Our government announced a policy 2 weeks ago to try and stabilize that, which also create a lot of tension and other things in our economy. I think the point I'm trying to make is the government has very little resources to support our population, the unemployed people, the hungry people, and also to transfer land and to transform the rural areas. So we're really not in a very good space. To add on to Humberto, this is larger farms, corporate farms. We're finding that corporate farms are becoming more and more important because they need outside capital. And you can see for the last couple of years, our exports really took off. And I think what's interesting, it is not in the basic commodities that we're competing on the international market, like maize and wheat and so forth. It's more on the specialized products, the fruits, the nuts, the wines. And fortunately, the ambassador referred to that. Our wines are very good quality. But again, it was disrupted during the COVID that wine farms couldn't sell any wine. We couldn't export wine, so we're sitting with a huge surplus of wine. But very important, it's more labor-intensive farms and irrigation farms that are competing. We are importing a lot of broiler meat, especially subsidized meat from the European Union. There's a lot of problems with that. We import rice, we import wheat, soybeans, products, and palm oil. So we're really exporting more horticultural products than basic commodities because we're not able to compete with that. Then if we go to the next slide, just to give you an idea of the composition of our farmers in South Africa, to add on to the taxonomy in our agriculture. The 2080 principle that we talk a lot about in economics is really what we've seen, and you will see a lot. At the top part, the large, medium, and small scale farmers are in the order of 40,000 farms. It has dropped significantly with the period of deregulation. As farms grew bigger, and they got more corporatized. And then you will see we've got 1.3 million of subsistence farmers at the bottom, and this is where government is focusing their effort. But unfortunately, there's a lot of issues, and we're not very successful in transforming currently that bottom part of our farming sector, which also create tensions going forward. And the other thing that worries us, with urbanization, we've got about 50,000 corporate farms that really supply our urban population with food. The poor people in the rural areas are also dependent on that. So, Humberto, I think you can argue that also increased vulnerability because you're really depending on a number of large farms. In our agricultural production, Humberto also referred to that, it grew a lot. Then you will see our field crops decreased from 46% in the 1970s to 28%. Horticulture grew and animal production grew a lot because we're an extensive rainfall country. So there's a lot of animal husbandry going on, but you'll see the growth was in horticulture and livestock products. In the livestock, just to add to that quickly, a lot of this is intensive livestock. The broiler industry and the pig industry have grown a lot in South Africa. And the way they can compete is again by large commercial units, economies of scale that are excluding the small scale farmers that can't get to the same level of production cost or the same biological safety standards. The other thing, I think we're really dependent on international technology. John Deere's, Monsanto, everything in South Africa is like you're in rural America, United States. And again, this is dependent, we're really dependent on international technology to be able to compete. I think that's an important part. Our government research facilities are not working very well. We're running out of money. So the result is, again, economies of scale, large concentration in farming units. And then we have another problem in that we have about 4 or 5 retail supermarkets that control 70 to 80% of the market. So for a small scale farmer to get his products on the shelves is really a big issue. And we're working on trying to change that. And this is sort of adding to urbanization. So the next thing that is happening, and I refer to that, is our urban people are changing diets. Takeaway foods, KFCs, etc., are really important. So our basic staples are changing from maize meal and into more protein type of diet. And then we've already referred to export. So a big change in the composition of agriculture busy taking place, and Umberto also referred to some of that. So here you can see the shift in the growth is, again, how this have changed over the last number of years. And you can see that the field crops have grown not as much, and that this is economies of scale that are really big issues there, large commercial grain farms. And you will see horticulture and animal production have grown, and that was also driven by urbanization and changes in diets. Our animal production, as I referred to, intensive livestock, or the broilers and the egg production, pig production is really very economies of scale, again, feeding the urban people. This table gives you an idea of the changes in the consumption patterns that happened over the last couple of years in the period that we did the research for the book. And you will see that red meat production moved, sorry, to go back. Red meat production increased per capita. You will see that white meat production increased also quite strongly. And you will see that egg consumption increased, fresh milk. And if you go down the bottom, you will see that our maize consumption dropped a little bit, wheat. So a change in the food consumption pattern that also worked back to our agricultural sector and agri-production. On the trade policy side, Umberto also referred to that in his opening part. We signed a number of trade deals that opened our borders. We had trade protection, we had quantitative barriers in place. All that were dropped in the early 80s, late 80s, early 90s. It opened our market to domestic competition. And what we found is that with little protection, we were really forced into economies of scale. Our wheat industry were forced out of production because we just couldn't compete with international markets. So currently South Africa is a large importer of wheat, and a lot of this is coming from the European Union at no protection at all. So our farmers are really having trouble to compete with that. And then the relative cheap imports, and this is the debate we're having. The cheap imports are really assisting urbanized poor consumers, 70% of the population. Umberto referred to that. And the debate is, do you import cheap foodstuffs to feed your urbanized population, or do you try and protect your borders to grow your domestic supply? And this debate hasn't been settled in South Africa. And the result is the small-scale farmers are getting squeezed into this. I also referred in part of our policy that's coming more and more important is that our retail sector are very concentrated. So if you're not a large producer, if you can't get large quantities into the supermarkets, you don't get access to the market. And then there's a current debate emerging. How do we balance this out? Do we leave our borders open, getting sort of sucked into competing with the international markets, or do we build sort of a little bit of a protection, but at a cost to the consumer? So that debate hasn't been settled yet. And then the other thing that we also did in South Africa, there was a lot of labor reform. Our markets are really liberal. We've got one of the best labor acts and policies in the world, very liberal, large or relative high minimum wages. And the debate is that should a country with 40% unemployment have relative high minimum wages? That debate is still going on. There is people that believe it contributes to unemployment. The problem is also if you're a small-scale farmer, the Act doesn't exclude you. So you have to pay the relative high minimum wage, which again just creates this divide in our agricultural system. And then it pushes us more into the international market by getting more and more sort of dependent on international technologies, mechanization, GMO seeds, and things like that. So this is an ongoing debate in South Africa. We haven't settled it. So there's about 3 minutes left of my time. So let's go to the concluding remarks. I think the first one that we found, and a lot of this overlap with Roberto's, is liberalizing domestic markets, integrated our agriculture into international markets. That is one of the main findings of the chapter. I think the next one that we also refer to is free trade agreements was signed in our case with the European Union as an example. We're busy dealing with China, which is not in your case a big issue, but China is a huge debate in South African trade and how do we protect our manufacturing base and production base. And all of this resulted in really our agriculture being pushed into the international market, into large subsidized exporting countries, which forced our agri to adapt to more larger scale farming technologies, and also that our farms increased in size. And again, this is a big debate. Do you have 30 or 40 or 50,000 large corporate farms that feed the urban population? Or do you put a limit on that? And Roberto referred to the ceiling on land size, but then you have to develop your markets and to get your supply chains for small-scale farmers into the retail sector. So again, I think the question is, how do we compete as developing countries into an international market with a lot of subsidies? Mr. Trump, you would have noticed during the last year or two with his trade wars with China, he doled out a lot of subsidies to his farmers, and the Europeans are not far behind that. I think the other thing that we have in common is that land ownership and land redistribution is a common policy. In the case of South Africa, I dare to say we haven't been at this so long as Mexico, and we're really struggling to make this working successful. There's a number of blocks in this path, but it's a big debate. How do we try to change our land ownership system without dropping supply of relative affordable food into our urban population? So that debate is still going on in our policies in both countries to some extent. Then what we've also found is that agriculture, especially in the early years of deregulation, shed a lot of labor. And if you go into our rural areas, there's really a lot of poverty because farms got bigger, more mechanized, more industrialized, and we're really worried in South Africa that rural poverty is increasing to a large extent. In both countries, exports have grown a lot, which has a lot of different domestic implications. Umberto referred to that. I think we're fortunate in the case that we can't compete on basic food in the international market. So our exports are more expensive horticultural product that we can be competitive into the international market, especially into Europe and China, while you are more linked into the American market. And then to both countries, land degradation and destruction of biodiversity is a big issue. Big battles, how do we protect our limited high potential agricultural land from mining, from urbanization, and just to keep our water systems going is a big challenge, more in South Africa, I believe, than in Mexico. Then the other conclusion and sort of overlapping remark is that growth in populations, urbanizations, and land reform will remain a challenge to supply sufficient, affordable, and nutritious food in the next few decades, given the current characteristics shaped by outside forces. And I need to recommend Humberto on the emphasis he's putting on this, that the outside international markets deregulation really are shaping our domestic agricultural sector. And I don't think we've got to grasp how we need to manage that and solve that. Mr. Chair, I think that is my contribution. We're running out of time. And thank you very much for the opportunity to work on a project. And my email is on my slides. If you want to email me, you're very welcome. I'll just put the first page up again. That's my email. You're welcome. Thank you, Chair, and I conclude my presentation.
Thank you, Professor Johannes Williamson. It's been very, very interesting to hear the South African side of this discussion. We go now to the questions and answers, part of the event. There is an interesting question that has come through our chat. If Professor Dion Heldenhuis or Professor Johannes Williamson would like to answer that question. So Mr. David du Plessis, please. Thank you.
Dion, do you want me to go?
Yes,
Yeah, please.
Professor, please do.
Okay, David du Plessis, and what he said is, let me just quickly see, do you see that the USA as an international partner or international spoiler with regard to the sector and to international regional cooperation? The US is not our biggest problem in South Africa. We really have a lot of issues how to compete with European products, especially a good example is broilers, where our demands are very different in our food demand, and we get a lot of subsidized broiler production from the Europeans' dairy products. And then also Brazil and Argentina are very competitive. The US is not really an exporter of products to South Africa. We are exporting a lot of horticultural products. So I think the US don't play a big role in our country as compared to Mexico, where in Mexico's case, it's really very dominant. In South Africa, not. Europe is much more dominant in our case. The second question is GMO solutions in South Africa. To give you an idea, about 80 to 90% of our maize production is GMO seeds. And the farmer said that if it wasn't for this technology of GMO, we would not be able to compete with the Americans and the Argentinians with their much better resourced agriculture. So I think South Africa is one of the world's highest levels of adoption of GMO seeds. And the farmers claim it contributed to a lot to that. We have a surplus of maize and can produce that. The third question is, could Mexico and South Africa become anchors for a closer cross-Atlantic cooperative continental and regional framework? I'm not so sure. Mexico is not really high in our agricultural sector's mind because it's not very known. We are busy focusing a lot on the region, and we're busy signing a free trade agreement in Africa and to create a free trade bloc, and we're looking a lot into China. So, and I think the distance between Mexico and South Africa is maybe a little bit of a problem. And then we both more in the southern hemisphere that we compete in the same markets exporting to the northern hemisphere. John, I think that would be my quick contribution to that questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Johannes Williamson, answering the questions that David Duplessis put onto our question and answers in our chat room. And thank you very, very much for that. I would like to now ask our Executive Director, Dr. Philani Mthembu, to do our summary and the way forward for this chapter. Thank you. Dr. Philani Mthembu, you've got the floor.
Thank you, Susanna. I think I'll sort of just give a few impressions. I still actually wanted to just put one question through because I just felt it was quite, I mean, it was very interesting looking at this trend, looking at both Mexico, but also looking at South Africa, the level of consolidation in terms of in our production systems, and I'm really quite interested about looking ahead. What I said in some of my opening remarks, I focused a lot on the issue of the creation of regional value chains, and I'm really quite interested in sort of any of the colleagues who gave very fascinating presentations. Is it I mean, do we still have room, policy room, when it comes to international trade agreements? Or, I mean, has a country like South Africa overexposed itself and become too open to international markets? And I mean, you know, it was put so perfectly that we're competing with products that are subsidized, yet we are not subsidizing our own farmers and are not giving them, you know, the type of support that they may need. Yes, there was that interesting graph which looked at sort of where the government's resources have gone, you know, to your emerging farmers and so forth. But there's a lot of challenges there. I'm just quite interested in how, you know, how the presenters are looking at the current policy space. And I'm saying this with the context in mind of the current, you know, position of the head of the World Trade Organization and what type of reforms could take place within the WTO. I'm also saying this within the context of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Is there space within that to actually build those regional value chains? Or are we essentially creating a market for these major producers to continue to export into? Or are we actually, do we have the right policies to actually create those value chains? And just lastly, maybe for Johannes, is to look at what are some of the opportunities in our region in terms of indigenous crops. I'm thinking, for instance, like mabele, or what's this, the English term, sorghum. Yeah, so I'm thinking, yes, sorghum. So I'm thinking, exactly. So I'm thinking, for instance, like that, what opportunities are there? So Susanna, that was sort of just my impressions, but I would be really interested to also get a bit of insights from you know, around those particular issues.
I think if Umberto wants to go first, I'll add to that. Thank you.
Okay, Dion, you can add some comments there as well.
Bueno, puedo sobre el punto de cómo veo ahorita en este momento la situación de México y de Sudáfrica. Realmente de cuando hicimos nosotros el trabajo a estos días han cambiado muchas cosas, tanto en México como supongo también en Sudáfrica. Yo veo que el camino que se ha seguido, realmente sabemos un final en este momento. Y el final realmente es las limitaciones que se nos presentan para alimentar a la población y que en tanto en el caso de Johan como mío, englobamos dentro del concepto de vulnerabilidad agrícola y alimentaria. Es decir, el camino realmente es ese. Podemos seguir exportando. México en los últimos años ha incrementado enormemente, realmente, sobre todo en los cultivos, en los mismos cultivos que Sudáfrica. De alguna manera competimos por los mismos mercados. Pero el efecto que esto tiene en el medio ambiente es una degradación. El efecto que esto tiene en la salud también es una degradación, no solamente en los trabajadores, sino también en los consumidores de estos alimentos. Y finalmente estamos dependiendo cada vez más realmente de la importación de los productos básicos. Entonces, la pregunta que surge es, si vamos por esta vía, realmente sabemos cuál va a ser el final. Y sobre todo cuando se nos presenta una situación que está afectando a todo el mundo, que es el cambio climático. Realmente tenemos un problema enfrente que hemos dado la vuelta y que no queremos afrontar, ¿no? Hay otra situación que también tiene que ver y es la enorme degradación de la salud. En esto puedo decir, las investigaciones que estamos haciendo en este momento es el daño realmente que están causando los pesticidas, los plaguicidas en la salud, digamos, no solamente de los que están trabajando, sino también de las poblaciones. Y aquí hemos encontrado nosotros que en poblaciones rurales hay niños de 3 años que están realmente orinando hasta 12, 14 plaguicidas en una proporción pues muy preocupante que está afectando a su salud. Es decir, aquí se abre pues una reflexión sobre que el camino realmente que queremos más viable para el país, pues probablemente no es seguir en la misma línea, sino realmente replantearnos el patrón de desarrollo que hemos seguido y apoyar las prioridades de alimentación y de bienestar de nuestras poblaciones. Mientras no tengamos esto claro, entonces no podemos tomar políticas realmente que nos permitan valorizar estas prioridades. Yo creo, dejo la palabra a Johan, creo que en esto es interesante que hemos coincidido. Él es un economista, realmente, yo soy más antropólogo, pero finalmente en las visiones de conjunto creo que nos damos cuenta que hay bastantes similitudes en el análisis y en las perspectivas.
Thank you, Humberto. If I can add, I think I agree we haven't found the balance between urban population, food, affordable, safe food, and how to protect our farming sector from the international multinationals. I think that debate is going. Number two, I think we were a big proponent of the World Trade Organization and free trade in 1990s, 1994 with democratization. And I think we're busy realizing that to open our markets so much to the large industrial countries is creating problems, especially in our case, China is having a huge impact on our manufacturing base. I think the third comment is we've started now with master plans in our policy space to say, how do we look at the whole value chain and the sector, coming back to Dr. Polani's question, to take a value chain approach and to say, it's not much use just to look at the primary production. You need to look at your whole value chain to be competitive and protect your domestic production base. I think that's what it's coming to. And the last comment, Dr. Polani, is Yes, I think there's a strong push for South Africa to integrate more into our African neighboring countries. If you look at our agricultural exports, is growing quite substantially into neighboring countries like Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Angola, and so forth. So I think there's more push to integrate into our region than to go into the European United States type of space. So I think that the balance is shifting, but the cost of industrialization, liberalization, to add to Umberto, was really high, I believe, in our country's case. Thank you.
Dion, have you just got 2 words of way forward? Professor Dion Heldenay?
I think the preceding discussion on food and agricultural vulnerability has already thrown out a number of areas for further research. Umberto also made the point that many things have changed since we conducted our comparative study. So an update in itself, I think, is called for, but then also, as I say, new avenues for exploration. And although we focused only on one of the 10 themes in our book, I'd like to reiterate that in many of the other areas, there is, to my mind, also ample opportunity for further exchanges of ideas, inquiries on both sides by the same people who participated in the book or other colleagues who might be interested in taking forward the debate that I hope we have unleashed through the publication. And thanks, if I may finally express my sincere gratitude for the Institute for Global Dialogue for staging this seminar, and I hope that those who have listened to the discussion have drawn benefit from it. And of course, to put in a plug for the book, get hold of the publisher is Peter Lang in Brussels. I'm not sure that the book is on sale in South Africa, but check Peter Lang's webpage, and I'm sure people would be able to obtain the book. Thank you, Susanna.
Thank you, Professor Heldenay. Just a few minutes for the Ambassador Ana Luisa Faher. She wants to ask also a question or have a last word. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna. Thank you for those amazing and super interesting presentations. Really, I learned a lot, and I promise to read that chapter. I have it here, the book, but I promise to read the chapter. It's really interesting. I have a question for you, for Professor Willems, and one for Dr. Humberto Gonzalez. If I may just start with Professor Willems. Yesterday, I heard the CEO of PepsiCo for Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia proposing to establish an agricultural ecosystem with the participation of commercial and emergent farmers, academia, startups, and the big companies working together, working collectively, and linking to the value chain. What do you think about this?
Yes, I totally agree, Ambassador, that is where it seems that the debate is drifting to. We can spend a lot of money in our rural areas on small-scale farmers. The problem is our consumers are in the cities, and how to get that product into the city and on the shelf. So there's a current debate to say, how do we link them into the commercial value chain? And yes, that is where it's going, and I think it's a very good idea. That's because as a farmer, you can only make money if you can get your product to the market and get your money to you. And the small-scale farmers are unfortunately still excluded by that. And by the way, there's also a by-result of deregulation, because we had marketing boards that assisted and protected small-scale farmers, but we closed all that down. So now we find part of liberalization was a negative effect on the small scale farmers. So yes, I support that idea totally.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your comment. Dr. Humberto Gonzalez, if I may just, first, it's a pleasure to see you on the screen after we had an opportunity to have a conversation, phone conversation, but now I'm seeing you on the screen. I will visit you in Mexico when I go soon. Regarding what you said about the agricultural trade being concentrated heavily in the U.S., do you envisage any real possibility for diversification vis-a-vis the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, for instance, and in particular South Africa? Do you envisage any kind of diversification in the real world? Because we talk a lot about the diversification in every single sector, but in this particular case, what is your view on this?
Bueno, nosotros hablamos de vulnerabilidad, pero también hablamos de pérdida de soberanía. En el caso de México, esta pérdida de soberanía es mayor que en Sudáfrica, porque realmente nosotros dependemos para importar alimentos y para exportar alimentos, dependemos de Estados Unidos. Yo tenía la esperanza de que con este presidente que está por salir, pues de alguna manera hubiera conciencia de este riesgo tan enorme que corremos en México de estar tan articulados y tan dependientes, la palabra es dependientes, con las políticas de nuestro vecino. Y lo que me doy cuenta en la parte agroalimentaria, la situación no ha cambiado mucho. Hay ciertas mejoras, ciertos cambios, como por ejemplo esta política de etiquetación y esta atención que se da a la nutrición. Pero nada más, en las exportaciones la situación sigue igual, no cambia. Entonces, la degradación de los recursos naturales, donde ponemos en riesgo la alimentación de las generaciones que van a venir en un futuro y que son más que las que estamos en este momento, pues no se está tomando en cuenta. Creo, existe la posibilidad de diversificar, sí, realmente, pero no lo veo en el grupo, pues, dominante de los empresarios mexicanos. Quieren realmente aprovechar las ventajas de estar en un mercado cercano, que es el de Estados Unidos, y prefieren correr riesgos a realmente diversificar el comercio, ¿no? Creo que falta una visión más de política en el contexto internacional para ver lo que estamos realmente apostando en cuanto a soberanía agroalimentaria, ¿no?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. At this point, I think it's now a time to would like to thank the two co-editors, Professor Dion Heldenhuis and Professor Humberto Gonzalez, and our co-host, the Embassy of Mexico, for entrusting us with the organization of this webinar. We wish Professor Humberto Gonzalez all the best luck in the last leg of the editing of the Spanish version of the book. So, in other words, this book will be published in Spanish, and I think that's also a tremendous work that the professor is doing. And last but not least, thank the the Institute of Global Dialogue team for co-hosting this event. And I hope to do similar events or webinars on other chapters of the book, because we basically only discuss one chapter of this book. There is 9 more chapters which are, ready for discussion. And thank you to all our who registered in this webinar. Your virtual engagement is much appreciated. Thank you very much to all of you. You've been wonderful to work with in the last few weeks. It's been a pleasure to come to know you, and hope to see you again in other webinars. Thank you so very much. Over to you, Arina.
Thanks, everyone. I think this webinar is now closed. Goodbye. See you next time.
Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you.
Gracias. Thank you.
Thanks,
Adios.
Ambassador.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Gabriela Colin,
professors.
for your efforts
Thank you,
as well.
Susanna.
Thank you, Susana. Thank you,
Thank you.
Gabriela.
A pleasure. It was a pleasure.
Gracias.
Bye.
Bye.
Gracias. Bye.
Bye.